Before I got arrested, I had thought about the potential to be arrested quite a lot, and I'd considered what I would say if that did happen. So I was quite confident when they came, and I thought it through. You know, I wasn't doing anything wrong, wasn't doing anything to hurt anybody, and if I was to be punished for that, then that was going to just show the injustice. So we would go through with that. So I didn't feel at all any fear when they came through. And so I initially didn't want them to come in, but they informed me that they had to come in because it's not my place of residence. So I let them in and told them that it was the bakery for the Cannabis Buyers Club, and it seemed that they were somewhat surprised by my forwardness and my willingness to tell them that what they would be doing there would be wrong, and why it would be wrong, and what would be the effects of what their actions there would be.
Welcome back to another edition of Cannabis in Canada with Jason Wilcox. I'm sitting here with none other than Owen Smith himself. Owen, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
For our viewers, Owen is was basically charged back in 2008 for production for the purpose of trafficking THC. And what resulted in that is a constitutional challenge, and we're going to get into that. But first, what I'd like to get into for our viewers to fully understand is the history behind two men. There's Owen Smith and there's Ted Smith. These two men I've known for a very long time. I've watched their work, and what we're going to get into is some of the history up to the present, and then get into Mr. Smith and some of the stuff that he had even prior to Owen's problems in 2008. So Owen, when you first discovered hempology and Ted Smith, maybe tell us a bit about that, your introduction to cannabis, if you have it.
Yeah, well, I came from England. And in England, there's really not the same cannabis movement at all. It's not the same situation. So I really didn't know anything about it when I moved to Canada in '94. My family either. They didn't know that they were moving me into a hotbed of cannabis activism and that it would take over my life eventually. When I went to UVic, shortly after high school, I heard about Ted Smith's circles that he did there. And I had a basic interest in learning about hemp. I'd read Jack Herer's book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, and I wanted to know more about cannabis. I was introduced to it from a close friend, and it was something which, while I enjoyed it, I didn't really have the best relationship with cannabis, and I felt like, from what I'd read too, and what people said around me, that it was something which perhaps was the cause of some of my problems. And it wasn't until I started to see some people who were really good role models for cannabis, like Ted Smith and other people who I met, educated folks who started to learn more about it, was that a kind of excuse swept away, and I realized that it's not cannabis that's my problems, it's me, and I can use cannabis and I can also achieve things, and many people do, and do quite well. So going to the university to kind of learn a few things from Ted Smith seemed like a great idea. And he had the Cannabis Buyers Club at the time, so he started to kind of introduce me to the club. I offered to volunteer at the Camosun Hempology Club when I went there. This was a little ways after high school, and he has conventions, and now we're up to number 16 next year, and they're getting really great speakers now. And back then, I think we had Chris Bennett. Some of them have been doing it every year for a long time. But I started my graphic design then, and I made a poster of the 6th convention and put it up around town, kind of just doing some volunteer stuff for Ted and the club. And I went and spoke with the student body at Camosun about the club, and to the administration, in order for them to feel comfortable with having a cannabis club there. They needed to know somebody was responsible.
Just to be sure, when we say club, we don't mean dispensary. We're talking about the Hempology 101 University Campus Club, where university students would come together and learn about cannabis, not only through a lecture series, because I used to lecture for that series around the time Owen was hired, and in 2008, and very proud to actually have a Hempology 101 certificate, one of the few, for completing all the classes. But definitely an educational platform. But just for the record, those clubs are university clubs at Camolson and we have one here now in Vancouver as well.
At UBC, now that club is going strong. We just had a meeting with them at the BCMP the other night, and they do weekly 420s up there on Fridays. But the University of Victoria Club was being the largest one for a long time. They get circles of up to 350 people in the summer, or in the school year, earlier in the spring. So that's an influential, it's an influential place, and I've met some more people in Vancouver this weekend at dispensaries who have been influenced by Ted's work, by being public, by being out there, where somebody can just come across you. They can make the choice to attend that kind of event, which is a protest, but peaceful protest, where education is really the focus. And Ted was really a whirlwind on the microphone, and he really made an impact on me, watching how he commanded a circle of 200 people smoking cannabis, with very political messages, with activist messages, and with education. That kind of thing is rare, I think, and those kind of people are pretty rare. So Ted's work is really put a lot of stuff in motion for a bunch of people, myself included.
Absolutely. So when you started, now just prior to starting in 2008, you had a personal and I remember speaking to you about it way back then, was your experience with your sister. How has that driven your activism, would you say, moving forward after you went through that unfortunate experience, but also eye-opening experience, I think?
Yeah, it's usually the case that that people have to be affected closely by something before they really realize how much of a difference they could potentially make in that. It was my case. That was my younger sister who died of cancer, of kind of skin cancer. She'd used cannabis near the end of her life for quality of life, although she still died of the cancer. She was able to really help my family with that transition. It was really a incredible compassionate experience for somebody to be able to help the family through, and that person to be dying. The ability to communicate had to be restored, and that was cannabis did. The ability to eat is part of that, and sleep. Those things all tied together in what cannabis was able to offer. And my family was quite conservative before that, so they all switched over. But my being arrested was still tough on my family, and it's been wonderful for them to see the victories as well.
Would you say that was a driving force towards some of your ongoing work? I mean, after you were acquitted, you could have just walked away. The judge acquitted you. You could have just walked away from the whole cannabis scene and said, you know what, I'm done with this. But instead, you stayed forward looking and continued to educate about cannabinoid profiles, the full spectrum, the endogenous system.
I think it's the love for my family, which is really the basis of it. And the bond between family that's so close, and that can be really torn apart by a deadly disease like cancer. That's really been, I don't want other people to have to go through that. I don't want other families to have to face those kind of things. Like you did the interview with the young man and Aiden, the child, and that kind of stuff is devastating to hear. And there should be options for people with serious conditions, and we are really behind in offering these kinds of things. So I'd like to get it out of the way, and if we can have more science address the situation to make these doctors who are very opposed to cannabis treatments consider it. That's what I'd like to see happen. And
I think that's what needs to happen. I mean, honestly, they haven't explored it enough, and it just seems to be, I mean, it's a whole nother issue. We're going to keep hitting them, you know, legally and politically and educating. And you're right, Ted and various other activists have led the way in Canada in introducing cannabinoids in the full spectrum and what that means. And it sounds like French to a lot of people when you get into the science of the plant, just like extractions in your case. Let's get into your case. In 2008, you were arrested at the View Towers, as I recall, in an apartment, and you were a DJ.
That's
so
right.
my question I always wondered is, did the police come because of your DJ loud music, or did they come because of the smell of the baking?
We heard from the building manager afterwards that somebody else in the building was making hash oil, honey oil extractions, which is something which produces dangerous fumes, and that attracted the attention of the building manager to the point of calling the police. Well, we'd been in that building for years, so that smell was a common thing. When the...
You mean like the regular baking smell was
butter
common?
Smell, because what I was making was vegetable oil based. Yeah. It was not solvent extractions. So it wasn't uncommon for us. We had, I had an air purifier, and admittedly it was kind of getting old, but we did have incense burning in that too, so it was common that we would try to mask the smell. But I did have music playing, and because I was training myself for DJing, and it's electronic music to kind of give me energy while I bake, and that might have attracted them to the door. They were really polite, and they told me that while I was getting the rock star treatment, one of the police officers who came through the door actually is familiar to the club, and he knew Ted. He'd actually, this gentleman has been, he's communicated with us before about his family using cannabis in India, and how in India they have a holy festival where everybody eats cannabis and drinks cannabis drinks, and he even shared with us a recipe for cannabis pakoras. So it was when I recognized him, and I had a feeling, and before I got arrested, I had thought about the potential to be arrested quite a lot, and I'd considered what I would say if that did happen. So I was quite confident when they came, and I thought it through. You know, I wasn't doing anything wrong, wasn't doing anything to hurt anybody, and if I was to be punished for that, then that was going to just show the injustice. So we would go through with that. So I didn't feel at all any fear when they came through. And so I initially didn't want them to come in, but they informed me that they had to come in because it's not my place of residence. So I let them in and told them that it was the bakery for the Cannabis Buyers Club, and it seemed that they were somewhat surprised by my forwardness and my willingness to tell them that what they would be doing there would be wrong, and why it would be wrong, and what would be the effects of what their actions there would be. I understood that they would have to do something. They would have to take what I had, likely. The main reason is because there was one bud that was exposed on the table. So as soon as they saw that one exposed bud, it's like, oh, well, now we've seen cannabis. We know it's a bakery. And they called in some people. The next police officer to arrive was David Bratzer. I turned around, and David Bratzer is representative for LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. So when I recognized him, you know, I felt even more assured that you know, what was happening was in some ways necessary, that it was part of a historical process that had even infiltrated the police. As two of the three officers I knew had some association to supporting cannabis. They didn't handcuff me, and they did interrogate me for some time, but only because I didn't have any ID on me and they needed to identify me. So it was mostly for that purpose, and also because Health Canada did not tell them, they could not clarify very quickly whether or not the address had a license and whether or not I had a license and these kind of things. So I sat in the cell for about 8 hours. And then I got out about midnight and went to the club where Ted was still waiting, and with a couple of the staff members. And I got back there and it was like, you know, like Ted was like, this is it. He knew right away. We're going all the way with this.
Well, and, to that, I mean, Ted, I know you're watching, and you know what, to take it to that, I go back to the cookie case, and Ted knows that I remember that, because I remember speaking and, you know, holding up cookies when Ted was giving away cookies, and I think he gave one to an officer or something. I can't remember the specifics, but his initial extraction case was one that we talked about for years, because the MMAR was never clear about whether you could ingest it or whether you could smoke it. It allowed for both. So we always argued if this could be challenged, if this could be challenged, and Ted tried. Maybe you can fill us in on Ted's attempt.
Yeah, Ted went to the BC Court of Appeal. He had a case. He's been in court a number of times and has been successful. I think 10 times he's beaten charges, or at least 10 charges have been beaten that relate to the club that Ted started. And Ted was giving away cookies at the library, and he did it 1 year and he got away with it. So the next year he thought, well, I'll tell the media that I'm going to do it. And he was in the newspaper the day before. And the next day the police showed up and they took the cookies, and he ended up getting charged with, I believe it was cannabis resin. And they attempted to beat the charges of cannabis resin by using a similar argument to, I think, watermelon, where there was not enough, testing evidence for testing the products to tell that they actually had THC in them to certain high levels that could be considered psychoactive. And it was a jury trial, and Ted lost. The jury thought that that wasn't very legit, and that they probably had more than just hemp, which, you know, I think he in retrospect, he might have used different arguments, and we did in the second round use different arguments, address something more pointedly scientific in the MMAR, the MMPR now. And so Ted, he lost. He had to spend one night in jail or pay a $500 fine, one of the two, or maybe both. But there was an organized rally, a raffle that raised $500 that day. So it's all incorporated into kind of a media campaign, and that is kind of there's a feedback loop there that I've experienced with, that Ted really takes advantage of, is the real reasons for doing these public activisms to kind of stir up attention and bring media attention to certain issues. So early on, Ted was very happy that the newspaper would cover the case so that more people could hear about it, because he doesn't believe in advertising, but the media can cover those kinds of things. Yeah, Ted's done a lot of activism, and the first time I went to court to see Ted battle, he won, and that was to establish the Cannabis Buyers Club in Victoria, and have their lacuna is what the legal term is. So in that case, I was sitting in the courtroom eating cannabis cookies, and it seems like foreshadowing to what happened later on.
So when we jump forward, before we get rained out here, we should jump forward to the, unfortunately the clouds are rolling in on us. I wish it was a more sunny day. But let's jump forward now. Judge Johnson, was it Judge Johnson that acquitted you?
Judge Johnston in the BC Supreme Court in 2012. He acquitted me in December. That was after the trial where we made extracts legal for patients. That trial was so brief. It was 10 minutes, and where the prosecution explained that they wouldn't be able to win in a jury trial because the judge had already ruled the law unconstitutional. So everyone would just agree with the judge. They wouldn't have their own opinion. And it was a very poor argument, something that didn't hold up in the BC Court of Appeal. Because the judge in the trial, Johnston, he was well aware that I'm not covered by the MMAR, and that what I was doing was providing for people outside of, people who didn't have access to the MMAR, but who had a medical declaration of their condition that was a permanent physical condition or disease. That's the standard that the club accepts, which was a lower standard than the regulations, the official government regulations.
Well, I'm going to cut you off there. We're going to segue out here, and we're going to actually get a canopy over us. I'm going to go medicate, and then Owen and I will come back on, and we're going to pick this up on where Canada's headed in the future and what's coming up with additional court cases. See you in the next part.